for note taking. But some portions, but some portions of this may also be used on social media. So please do let us know over email if you have any concerns about that. Feel free to share your thoughts, comments, and feedback in the chat section. We will have ample time for discussion after the presenters have spoken. Without much further ado, let me hand over to Ms. Clare Ehmann for her opening remarks. Clare is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance at USAID. Over to you, Clare.
Oh, thank you so much, Swati. And it's really an honor to be here to kick off this roundtable. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, the permanent ministers from Canada, the Netherlands, and Sierra Leone. And of course, our organizers. I would like to thank Pathfinders, the Justice Action Coalition, ODI, OECD, HiiL, and UNDP. Thank you so much for bringing us together. It's really exciting to be here during the Summit for the Future in New York City. It's really wonderful, and welcome to everyone who is able to join us online. I want to give some brief remarks just to share USAID's perspective on the importance of financing people-centered justice. And then we'll have other speakers, and then I hope we'll also have a really good amount of time for a very robust discussion. So according to the World Justice Project, an estimated 5.1 billion people lack meaningful access to justice. This number is likely increased as a result of the pandemic and also the myriad intersecting crises that we're facing today. In addition, the World Justice Project notes that respect for the rule of law has experienced a decline over the past 5 years, affecting the rights of over 6 billion. So given this, I think we all know that business as usual is really not going to drive progress. We really need a people-centered approach to justice if we're going to turn the tide to address the world's intersecting crises. People-centered justice is an encompassing approach to the rule of law and access to justice that places people and their needs at the center. It requires deep consultative understanding of the challenges people face and the context in which they face them. This understanding, in turn, informs appropriate, innovative solutions that are inclusive and impactful. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has noted that access to justice for all and effective, inclusive, and accountable institutions is a critical enabler for other SDGs. Yet, the purpose of our roundtable, we really see funding for justice systems is on the decline. That's really why at USAID, we think it's important to draw attention to this issue of financing people-centered justice so that we can achieve efficiency with the limited amount of funds that we have available. Working in international development, I know there is never enough money and there's always many, many issues. And so really we want to focus on people-centered justice approaches because really we do think they're very data-driven, they're evidence-based, and they really show what works. They're really best placed to efficiently and exponentially reduce the justice gap. People-centered justice policies and programs are really valuable investments because they meaningfully impact people's lives. They can also be planned and budgeted, measured, and monitored because they are data-driven and evidence-based. They're results-focused and they're participatory. And people-centered justice does deliver results. Part of this roundtable, we really do want to be building a strong business proposition for people-centered justice. We hope that supporting proven and investable models of justice service delivery can then trigger a compounding effect and attract further and greater investment over time, because this certainly is an issue that will take many, many years for us to work on. So USAID is really committed to propelling the global shift towards people-centered justice through both our support to international efforts like this and also through our assistance programming in countries all around the world. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those examples. USAID was a member of the Rule of Law and People-Centered Justice cohort at the Summit for Democracy that together with 9 other countries and 15 organizations negotiated and endorsed the joint statement and call to action on the rule of law and people-centered justice, renewing a core pillar of democracy. USAID was also a member of the 20-country and 18 organization strong Justice Action Coalition, and we also represent the United States on the Justice Action Coalition board, along with the US Department of Justice. So for us, it's also really a US government-wide effort. The Justice Action Coalition Working Group on Justice Financing is leading the creation of the Justice Financing Framework that's going to form the basis of the discussion today, which I know is sent out to everyone in advance, here at the sidelines of the Summit for the Future. So USAID, we're not only backing support for the Justice Action Coalition and people-centered justice with words, but we're also supporting it with resources. I'd like to officially announce today our new $600,000 award to the OECD for support of the Justice Action Coalition for Workstream 1, activities on data and evidence gathering. Moreover, we've also followed through on our commitment to fund other evidence learning and data collection and data sharing through our USAID Rule of Law Idea Lab. That provides a collaborative space to share knowledge, generate data, and develop cutting-edge tools to strengthen rule of law and promote people-centered justice. So along with our international commitments, we are also beginning to integrate people-centered justice into our rule of law program, programming globally. I want to just give you 3 different examples. The first, in Kyrgyzstan, USAID is helping to build a more responsive and impartial justice system by employing a people-centered justice approach to strengthen rule of law, combat corruption, and make systems more responsive, accountable, and transparent to the needs of the people. The project prioritizes addressing gender gaps and discriminative barriers for vulnerable groups, including youth and persons with disabilities. There's also open data portals that are providing access to court cases and decisions to help citizens learn more about legal protections and their rights. Another example is in Ukraine. Ukraine is the first country to organize specific national consultations on people-centered justice, and that's led to the development of roadmaps for government action, both on gender-based violence and also on informal employment. 2 national consultations brought together representatives from the national government, local government, the judiciary, the bar, the legal aid system, civil society, the donor community, and international experts. Then a working group, which included experts in domestic violence, engaged survivors about their needs and expectations, and developed a roadmap designed to improve justice by focusing on how restraining orders are issued. These processes are really providing citizens with multiple pathways to justice and empowering them to hold the justice system accountable while driving demand for meaningful change. And I think in that example, you also see just the large amount of stakeholders that you need to bring together to be able to really do this work properly. And then finally, in the Dominican Republic, USAID is implementing people-centered approaches that improve justice system responsiveness and accessibility for victims of violence and crime by building the sustainability of community justice houses. The project's also promoting alternative justice pathways to enhance access and empower individuals, including vulnerable groups, to know, use, and shape the law. So some of those examples in all of our initiatives and activities, they really contribute to advancing USAID's rule of law policy. That's the first ever official US government policy on the rule of law. The policy really renews USAID's commitment to stand for advancing justice, rights, and security for all. And I want to talk about there's 3 goals of the policy. It's really establishing a framework for USAID to work with its partners to promote justice, protect rights, and provide security. And then really a big pivot is really expanding the rule of law paradigm to include a people-centered justice approach that strives to identify and understand what people need and want when they seek justice, and to remove the obstacles that people face when doing so. Trying to improve their justice-seeking experience and enhance the outcomes that they might receive. And then finally, really at the heart of the policy is prioritizing local voices and really emphasizing the use of local systems and institutions instead of donor-driven approaches. So we're really excited about our new rule of law policy and also just the work that we are trying to pioneer in this area. But I think being here today at the Summit of the Future, it really provides us with a wonderful moment to explore impactful ways to achieve Agenda 2030. As we seek to strengthen multilateral cooperation, we also want to identify and support meaningful catalytic tools and frameworks that will help us achieve our objectives. So today's roundtable, I think, really proves to be a noteworthy step towards building a financing framework that will provide people-centered justice for all. And I would really like to thank the hosts for inviting me on behalf of USAID to kick off what promises to be a set of compelling presentations and the discussion. So thank you very much, and over to the next presenter. Over to Swati to facilitate the next presenter.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your inspiring opening remarks. And they have actually really set the tone for the discussion and laid the foundations for a very, very interesting people-centered justice discussion. Let me also take the opportunity to once again thank USAID for your leadership on people-centered justice, as you've mentioned, both through your international work, your membership on the Justice Action Coalition, but also through your programming in countries. It, I think, has and will make a lot of difference as we move forward. Just to briefly set the context, for those of you who may not know the Justice Action Coalition, it is a multi-stakeholder, cross-regional, high-ambition coalition of countries and organizations championing equal access to justice for all. And its guiding ambition is to close the justice gap, the global justice gap, and achieve measurable progress in justice outcomes for people and communities by 2030 and beyond. The coalition actually now is focused also, apart from international advocacy and profiling people-centered justice, it's also focused on providing certain deliverables and way forward to move on people-centered justice, and it's working through what it calls 4 work streams. So there's one on data and evidence that Clare also mentioned, which USAID is also funding OECD for. This data work stream is led by OECD. The second one is on actually programming within countries, and that's led by UNDP. And then there are 2 others, one on justice financing and advocacy narratives and linkages with SDG here within the UN community, and that we coordinate as Pathfinders. Pathfinders, UNDP, and OECD also serve as co-secretariats to the Justice Action Coalition. Today, we are here as part of the Workstream 4 to discuss the importance of effective financing. And again, as was mentioned, as we speak, the UN is actually in the process of negotiating the Pact for the Future, which is to be adopted in the coming days, hopefully on 22nd. We are seeing some animated, or should I say heated discussions on different versions of the Pact, with silence being broken. And we really hope that we do actually reach a pact which delivers for people and for the planet. The current version of the pact does recognize that we need to turbocharge the SDGs and that this requires financing, especially for the global south. We are also living in a world where people are really clamoring for justice. We've seen recent protests by young people in Bangladesh, in Kenya, all of which serves as stark reminders that our policies and systems must be just. And that for most people, justice and the concept of justice is much broader than a mere access to courts and to formal institutions. It's about their ability to prevent and resolve their problems and being able to participate in their economies and societies. And Clare, you mentioned it, absolutely correctly. The business as usual approach is not working. We do need a new way of thinking. And we do have a new way of thinking, which is people-centered justice. One which puts people's needs and priorities at its center. And we are seeing a lot of change. Over 60 countries have by now endorsed the principles of people-centered justice, USAID's policy on rule of law, the UN Secretary's new vision on rule of law, all promote and profile the importance of people-centered justice. OECD's recommendations on access to justice and people-centered justice were recently endorsed by the EU. So we seem to be moving in the right direction. There's this new wave of thinking, but this also requires innovative thinking on how to finance justice differently and effectively. Mind you, the discussion today is not about the sector needing more money, which wouldn't hurt, but the focus of today's discussion is on how we use existing resources more effectively to make a difference in people's lives. In most countries, the justice investments are often not directed towards scalable and impactful solutions. And justice leaders at the same time are being, asked to deliver. They're under constant pressure to demonstrate tangible results. And it is to address these challenges that the Workstream, the Justice Action Coalition Workstream on financing, is looking to support countries, donors, and others willing to pivot to a new approach of thinking about how to finance justice. And it is to this end that the Justice Framework will be produced by the Workstream. And you have some information about the financing framework, into which I will not go into, and both Theresa and our speakers will be speaking to. The meeting is a key opportunity to present this very first draft of the framework and to gather your feedback. intention is not to get into the weeds and into this word or that word, but to let the creators, the authors who are going to be our speakers, to broadly let them know if they're on the right track. Are there things that they have completely missed, which they should think about? You do have 3 guiding questions in the one-pager on the financing framework. So let's, without further ado, start by unpacking this financing framework. Let me quickly introduce our speakers. We have Theresa Smout, who's a program director at HiiL. She's worked for the UN on development challenges faced by the Global South, gaining experience in close to 30 countries. At HiiL, Theresa engages with a broad range of national actors on justice-related themes. She'll be followed by Manuel, who's a senior research associate at ODI. His current focus of research is on financing access to justice in lower-income countries. Marcus is an economist by training, scares me, and worked in the UK government for 20 years in senior roles in both Treasury and Foreign Office. For the last decade, he has been leading research at ODI on public finance issues, including taxation, aid, and social sector spending. Theresa, over to you and then Marcus.
Great. Thank you, Swati. I hope I can project enough for you all to hear. I just wanted to say one more sentence to the introduction that Swati kindly shared. And that is that, I've been involved in development from the programming side, but my interest in the financing part of the equation really came from a frustration with how the impact that was being created with great programs that were designed and then implemented as they were designed, and yet not really seeing a lot of traction happen because the part of the equation that needed to be worked out was the financing part, and how financing is developed is so important to actually ensuring that you get the impact that you're hoping to achieve through the goals that have been set, through the principles and benchmarks as well. And I think that is one point of emphasis to bring into the roundtable today, is that if you think about the goal of achieving people-centered justice without addressing how it will be financed and really looking at, can it be done more efficiently, more effectively, you're not going to get the impact you're looking for. And that is why through the JAC and through this partnership with ODI, HiiL has really been trying to unpack the financing part of the story. And that's what we're hoping to share with you today. And we're also inviting you, as much as you comment, please also ask questions, because we can work with that content. So if anything is unclear, Marcus and I would really welcome you coming back to ask questions, and we can go back to the drawing board and work with that. So let me not repeat what has already been said by Clare and Swati, because I think they set the frame, they framed today's discussion really well. There's just a couple of points to kind of zoom in on, and Marcus will build it up further with the data that he's sharing. Now, one of the things we did when we were working on the financing part of people-centered justice was to look at it from a different angle. So not to say, as Swati said, it's an additional resource, although that is welcome, but we're working with the basis that in today's resource-constrained world, how would we then pull together a credible financing framework? It's really important, because we're working in a reality that we can't escape. There are many global challenges that are pulling for attention. We have climate change, we have mass migration, we have widespread conflict, and we're also then dealing with 17 SDGs, all requiring, the attention of the same group of global partners. So we looked at it from that realism, like, let's be realistic about what traction we can get. And so the argument becomes, look at it as an investment not as a resource burden, not as an additional constraint. So look at it as an investment. And so we hope in today's roundtable that we'll be able to unpack a little bit more how justice can be seen as pivotal to other goals that a country could be working towards around economic growth, around employment generation, around stability, peace, etc. So that's one of the things we'll unpack today a little bit further. We're saying basically that ensuring accessible, efficient, and equitable justice systems, by ensuring that governments are laying the foundation for businesses to thrive, to attract investment, to foster innovation, to enhance public trust in institutions. So you're hearing in some of the things we're saying, the foundations for what we're trying to achieve, not justice, people-centered justice for the sake of it, but linking it to these other broader goals that, take a country forward in what it is broadly trying to achieve on the development front. Another point we hope to talk a little bit more about today is how exactly can justice take inspiration from sectors like health and education, where frontline service delivery, has been the main focus of everyone's collective attention, and how outcomes for people have been achieved. But alongside frontline service delivery is systemic reform, and that's really also important to stress. And I'm going to leave it to Marcus to make the case even further. Finally, a third point to emphasize is that we are working with a number of partners in the Justice Action Coalition. So we are drawing inspiration from, for instance, key documents put forward by the World Bank, some really innovative thinking, also with USAID, with UNDP, with IDLO. We're looking at a broad range of what other partners have done and learning from them to pull together some key metrics for the financing framework. So it is as wide, but we also hope we're trying to narrow it down to the essential, and then making the case as simple as possible in order to get your feedback and input to help us develop it further. Let me leave it there and hand it over to Marcus to share the data. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And Claire, thank you for your introduction and just framing it that way, and for USAID support. And Swati, thank you for your comments. You talk about lawyers being frightened of economists. I was going to say, as the only economist in the room, I suspect, and being surrounded by so many lawyers, that's a slightly scary experience. I should also say that my research partnership, I'm just one half of a research partnership. The better half of the research partnership is my wife, who's a lawyer, and who's going to be joining us virtually later. But yeah, economists talking to lawyers, that is probably one of the things I think we ought to happen more from both sides. So thank you very much. If you could have the next slide, please. So let me just dive in to begin with, just to talk about where are we on finance. I just want to give 3 slides on where we are on finance. So the first one, we're looking at here, OECD countries. And on the left-hand side, you can see the share of general government expenditure that is spent on 2 groups. So the bottom line is just the judiciary, and the top line is the whole justice sector. So that includes police and prisons, et cetera, et cetera. So as an economist looking at these things, one of the things just very striking is there is really not a lot of variation here over 20 years. It hasn't changed. And in particular, if you look closely, you can see that there was a slight dip during COVID and the total spend on justice, which has now recovered. But justice is now back to its 20-year average of 4.0%. And it really has hardly moved around that. If you look at the judiciary, they have got, such a consistent amount of spend. You think that ministries of finance around the world have clubbed together and said, the answer is 0.7% of government expenditure will go to judiciary, and it shall not change at any point in the year, and it shall be the same in all countries. But anyway, it's a very, very interesting sort of Anyway, very consistent. It doesn't really change very much. And that's true. If you look at health, even that's hardly changed very much. Budget shares don't change. There's an enormous inertia around them. Second slide. Now, the one thing that ODI has done is to actually gather data on what other countries spend. OECD countries are well publicized their spend. We have now finally managed to extend the data, and this is going to be published next month, to 155 countries. And we've got representation across all income groups with at least 75% of different income groups being covered by this data now, mainly by going to budget websites in individual countries. Now, again, what we're seeing here on the left-hand side, what is the percent of total government expenditure that is going on justice, so the bigger picture. And what's striking here is that whether you look at the average for low-income countries, the LICs, or lower middle-income countries, or upper middle-income countries, they all spend more on justice than the OECD countries do. So these countries are already prioritizing justice. Now, that's in a sense not a good piece of news, because what it suggests is in the long term, those countries are probably going to verge towards the OECD average. As other sectors come in and fight for resources, this is going to come under pressure. So when we're talking, we just need to say, okay, we're going to be under pressure here. We should be thankful we've got this amount. But in terms of direction of travel, doesn't look good. Unfortunately, we've got insufficient data to assess the trend over time, and this is the consistent picture of where we are at the moment. Could I have the next slide? And then final slide, we're not really talking particularly about aid here, but because I want to be focusing on domestic financing, but it is interesting to note that this is what's happened to justice's share of total global aid. And you can see it back 20 years ago, it was only about 1%. It then rose quite quickly. By 2010, 2011, 2012, it had actually peaked at over 3% of all justice aid. Since then, it has been falling. And as you can see now, it has fallen almost back to where it started. It's only just over 1%. The other thing that's worth noting is there are 3 types of aid we picked up here that we call justice aid. The one in orange is newly measured, ending violence against women and girls. And so that's the one that you can see suddenly gets recorded from 2016. It would have been buried in the previous data point, but it's been made visible now. That's risen, and that's actually stayed fairly static as a share over the last 4 or 5 years. The other one that stayed static almost throughout this whole picture is the one in green, which is just human rights. So funding for human rights institutions has remained a donor concern and a donor destination of funding for a long, long time. Remains so. What has really lost out is the win in blue, which, if you like, is the funding for core justice institutions. So not doing things that donors say these are particular things we're concerned about, but the rest of the whole justice system, if you like. And that's called legal and judicial development. And that has catastrophically fallen from 2.5% of all aid to under 0.5% of aid now. So, I mean, there's been a massive withdrawal of support, and we need to turn that round, but we need to also be aware that's been the direction of travel. Thank you. For the next slide. Next slide, I thought I'd also at least start bringing some good news, and this is one of 2 pieces. So I'm going to end with the good news, and this is my first bit. So what this shows is that smart justice spending matters. So we have on the bottom, public order and safety expenditure. That is the formal OECD word to describe justice spending as a percentage of total global expenditure. So you see there's a wide range. It averages around 4 for the OECD and around 6 for the rest. There is quite a wide range of spend across all these 123 countries. We then plotted it against the World Justice Project's latest 2023 Rule of Law Index to see how we're doing. Basically, the higher you are on the left-hand side, the better you are doing. What you can see, and we did the correlation, because economists like doing correlations, and the correlation is negative, so actually the more you spend, the worse your rule of law gets. It suggests probably that actually if you're Haiti in the bottom, you haven't spent a lot of money because you're in such a mess. So, causality and association are complicated issues. But what it does show is generally there is very little pattern. And if you look at, if you just look maybe between the 2, 4, and 6%, basically, you can be spending anywhere between 2 and 4 and 6% and have almost any rule of law outcome. So you can get very, very good. Some of the best ones are getting rule of law outcomes by only spending 2% of their government expenditure. It's a trivial chart, and we're going to do more research on it. literally, we've only produced this chart about a week ago, so it's sort of hot off the press. But it just shows smart spending matters, which is going back to Claire's point, is how we spend the money. And most of us are being effective, how we spend the money matters. Can we go to the next slide? So what do we take away from this? So we see two twin financial challenges. Firstly, there's enormous pressure on the existing system. If you talk to anyone in justice, they will say, my prisons are overcrowded, my judges are poorly paid, I haven't got enough police to cover all I want to do. There is no shortage of pressures on the existing system to carry on doing what it does. And as we can see, the chances of shifting justice share of spending is pretty low. And if anything, it's going to go down. So that's not good news. So when we then say, oh, we'd like to expand the system because there's a justice gap of 5 billion people, the action is, well, yes, that's very important, but haven't you seen I've got problem one? Oh, it's like, I can't even get to problem two. So this is where the Jack response comes in. So there's two big things happening. So first of all, it's about how do we make the business case for more resources and better spend. And the OECD and the World Bank are doing a lot of work on this. This is also about the evidence side. That's underway. We need to be realistic about what will come out of it, but we clearly need to make that case, how justice, on climate change, how justice helps health. There are lots of linkages we need to make the point. But this is then the thing, where does the justice financing framework come in? And that's the key point we want to talk about today. How can we start reimagining financing in order to do, and this is what Jack asked HiiL and OECD to start the process on. Can I just say there's two things the justice finance framework is and isn't. So what it is, it's about domestic finance, and it's about the central issue of Jack. How do we shift the justice financing gap? That's the Jack's sort of central point. You made the point, well, that is what its focus is. It therefore isn't an awful lot of other things that we'd be talking about for justice. So we're not talking about narcotics, we're not talking about human trafficking, we're not talking about migration, we're not talking combating decline in democracy, the space for civil society, the observation of human rights as a whole, many other things we could be talking about. This justice finance framework is just to help. How do we shift the dial? Justice gap. As I say, there may be other justice financing frameworks that are needed, but this is all we're trying to do today. The next slide. Thank you. So, reimagining justice financing, two things. It builds on the collective knowledge of this room and people online. And that's just enormously important. I hope that will come out of what we're saying. It builds on what the OECD recommendations talks about, need to be problems, need to be outcome focused, need to find out what the pathways, need to be evidence-based. It takes on board the USAID rule of law, which has really helped set out, the need for being data-driven. And also, if I just pick up a word that I've heard UNDP use, it's about going from locally led to global scale. I really love that as a sort of conceptualization of what we're trying to do. And it draws a lot from what is happening at a local level that we think needs to be scaled. And as Theresa said as well, it draws inspiration from other sectors. So education, 30 years ago, in many poor countries, half the kids were not in school. They had an enormous education gap in that sense. Health, they were suddenly faced with a challenge with the MDG to how do you halve child poverty within 15 years. Social protection, which I've worked on a lot recently, a report 3 years ago pointed out 4 billion people in the world will lack access to any form of social protection, any form of child benefit, paternity benefit, unemployment benefit, or pension. The good news that's happening there is they've just produced a report this month, which says for the first time the world has passed the milestone of 50%. They've got to 52% now. It used to be 43 in 2015. They are making progress on shifting a gap that is of the order of the 5.1 billion that we find so scary we look at. It is possible, but it takes a lot of work. The next slide, thank you. So this is a process. So the first thing to say is we're not going to solve this today. I'm sure you'll be reassured to know. But the idea is that there will be a JAC ministerial meeting at the end of 2025. So that's what we're shooting for. What you've got today actually is almost the first public airing of what Workstream 4 has ever done. So we had a meeting with the Workstream about 2 months ago. This is the first we want to broaden it to a wider group. So yeah, you're coming in very much at the beginning. And we will be continuing to report to the JAC board, we will continue to consult. There'll be no shortage of opportunities. And success for me today will be for others to say, that's great, we could contribute this. Because what we're conscious of, that HiiL and ODI alone, we can harvest some of the stuff that's going on, but it'd be much better to have the original organisation saying, okay, let me put this in directly and to engage. So we just need to work out how to do that. And I hope we can have side conversations going forward in the coming months about how we do that in the most time efficient and cost effective way. And as we said today, we've got some key questions at the bottom of your one page, and that's all we're trying to cover at the moment today. So can I have next slide? So at the moment, there are 6 key elements. I almost regard them as buckets, if you like. There are 6 areas where I think we need to, where the solution will lie. If we can get a better grip on these 6 aspects, this will help us. And what I want to do is just unpack some of those for you now, so you know the sorts of things we're thinking, and that might prompt you to think, that's great, because you can add on to that. Again, if we're missing a big bucket, let us know, because that would be very help to know at this side. You all have in front of you this paper, I hope, which sets out a bit about what's under each of these buckets. As I say, this is just the draft on the 10th of September. It's going to keep changing. It's already changed. Those who came to a meeting 2 months ago will notice it's changed quite dramatically from that. So we are continuing to evolve in it. And then there is a whole bit more additional background behind that. And if anyone wants to see it, please contact Pathfinders or ourselves. So first of all, starting with justice outcomes. Well, we said this before. This is the core reason for starting with the gap. How are we actually going to change the gap? Now, in some ways, that's quite radical, because a lot of budgeting always starts with what are the institutional needs of the different institutions, noting the judiciary are very independent and don't want to talk to anyone else in the process. So you've got different institutions all bidding for resources in a not necessarily very coordinated manner. So how do we get away from that for everyone to say, okay, we agree, just a gap in my country, how am I going to shift it? Because it's probably going to involve efficiency, it often involves coordination and cooperation. So how do we start to do that? Now, quite interestingly, I was personally involved in an unexpected policy experiment on education. So, as you may know, 20 or 30 years ago, we had this conversation about education. We've been saying, oh, there's lots of kids not at school, that's not really sad, but also we need to train the teachers, we need to get more books in, we need to change the curriculum, and all of those things we hope, or there's no evidence for it, will actually result in more kids coming to school. President of Uganda decided that what they wanted to do was abolish a user fee, which is $5 per person, per child in the country. And the World Bank said, well, that's very interesting. It won't really make much difference, probably about 10%, not important, but less than that. President said, I want to do this for political reasons, things are very important, so fine, do that. And so they said, fine, it's going to be free. When they turned up, they had 3 million kids enrolled in school. The first day of term the next year, 6 million kids turned up to school, which caused an enormous problem, as you can imagine, about where on earth you want to teach them all. It was also an enormous success. User fees clearly mattered much more than we all thought they did. And the World Bank very kindly came immediately along and said, we're going to give you an enormous policy loan because you need support now. So anyway, the World Bank made up for it. But there was, it did change. And then that became the evidence that changed everyone else. Everyone else did the same. And then we saw, and now there's very few countries which have that kind of education gap. So it can happen. Health, they were struck with the MDG, hour and a half mortality, and the WHO said, we don't know how to do this. So they actually commissioned a major report to say, how do we go about financing, how do we go about engaging on this? And in justice, we do have some of the answers already ourselves. I mean, Colombia is one of the most famous examples about this, which USAID supported from right at the beginning of 1995, now credited with having solved something like 15 million disputes. This is about operating at scale. So we do have within the justice sector some areas where this does happen. Argentina is another case where the access to justice centers moved millions of people as well. So if you start with the justice outcomes and say, okay, how do we shift the gap? You can actually start to think in different ways. And I think this is one of the things we need to do. Second thing, we need to think about spending priorities. So on primary education, it's striking, they actually have explicit targets. They have to say this amount of budget should go on education and this amount of budget should go on primary education. What's interesting is how were those targets created? And even more interestingly, why are they actually in generally being implemented? Which reminds us that this is a lot about political economy. So I think understanding the political economy about how you actually translate a presidential country priority into a spending priority is something we need to understand much better. On primary health, the concept got developed, it got a bit lost, but in the early 2000s it was picked up. Ethiopia was the famous case where, focusing on primary health, they achieved extraordinary health outcomes for very little spend. It was led by the then Minister of Health, who of course now is the head of the World Health Organization. They didn't go for share of budget. They just said there should be a minimum primary healthcare spend per person. It's the approach that they've done on that. And what's interesting is that primary health definition is still evolving. There's a major debate about what's going on. Sounds very familiar to Justice. Prioritizing key system functions aimed at individuals. If you want a definition of what primary justice would be, we might want to start with that one. But also they go on to say it's about empowering individuals to optimize their own health as co-developers of health. Sounds a lot about the empowerment stuff we will be talking about. Anyway, they found defining primary health helped them think conceptually about what they're doing. Efficiency and effectiveness. There are two key aspects around this. First, regulatory reform seems to be key to going to scale. Now we know that in health, they had to discover they didn't need a doctor in every village. What they needed was a community health worker in every village. If you retrain the traditional birth attendants, made them community health workers, you brought in the traditional health system into the formal health system. We've got the same happening in justice. Paralegals are increasingly playing a role, and one or two countries are becoming part of the system. But also it's about how we engage with customary justice. I think those of us who work in poorer countries know that's so important. And the work the IDLO is doing here in Somalia I think is really very interesting. 80–90% of disputes are resolved through customary law in Somalia. IDLO is helping them set up alternative dispute resolution centres, which now have formal jurisdiction over civil law disputes, so they're being integrated into the formal system. While at the same time have paralegals who work with local adjudicators to make sure that these disputes are being resolved in line with the national law, as well as Sharia law and customary law as well. So they're overseeing and making sure the system works. Generally, a lot of benefit for women in particular previously were blocked out from accessing law. So rethinking regulation procedures is probably going to be part of the answer of being about efficiency and effective. And then finally, there's the thing about research. It's very striking. I was with one of your USAID colleagues, and he was talking about how is it that Thailand has one of the highest life expectancies in the world with one of the lowest levels of health spending. And one of the things they've done is they've created their own dedicated health systems research institute. And this idea is being picked up and being replicated in other countries around the world. Entirely focused on thinking, what are the global lessons, how do they apply in Thailand, what works in Thailand, what are the cost effective that work in Thailand. You need to do the research to engage. I'm sorry, I'm a researcher, so I have to say it at some point. Finally, I just want to talk about costing, because I think this is the other good piece of good news. I think one of the things we have thought was that delivering frontline primary justice was just too expensive. And the short answer is, it is if you do it through donor-funded programs, or if you do it at small scale and fund an individual CSO to do 500 cases a year. When you go to scale, and Sierra had done this, when you go to scale and you go from 5,000 cases a year to 160,000 cases a year, you find the unit costs fall from $120 to $10. So I think the cost of some of reducing the gap might be less than we are scared that it could be. And in Malawi, we're seeing similar things. And even the IDLO example is interesting, quite low cost per case. So I think with a better handle on cost, we might have been more optimistic about what we can achieve to do. Have next slide. So there's a whole lot of background briefs. We're going to try and unpack some of this. This is a list of what we've currently got. We're very up for individuals to say, I'd love to do that one with you. Get in touch. Or I think you're missing this. Could we do this? We think we probably want to complement it with some sort of country stuff and say, here are some interesting country examples. So it'll be good to get that fleshed out. We'd love to see that expanded. And then final slide, which is just to conclude with the questions that we put together. Anyway, I hope that gives some of the flavour about where we are, where I think some of the challenges will be, but where I think also there is some hope. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, both Theresa and Marcus, for your remarks and for all the hard work that you've been doing on this and for making life for lawyers like us easier. Thank you so much for that. I'm sure we have many participants who wish to provide feedback, inputs. Please feel free to keep on putting your comments, any feedback in the chat function. But however, before I open the floor for discussion, let me invite Maaike to share her reflections on the draft framework. Maaike de Lange is the head of strategic programs and senior policy advisor on justice at OECD. She's a global expert on people-centered justice and has worked on access to justice issues throughout her career, both domestically in Netherlands and internationally, including the UNDP, the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Pathfinders. Maaike, over to you.
Thank you so much, Swati. Is the sound okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak. I wish I was with you in person in the room. It looks like you have a good crowd there. Although I am also joined by a lot of people online, which is also a good crowd. So let me start by thanking, of course, Canada, Sierra Leone, USAID, UNDP, and Pathfinders for hosting and organizing this event. And a special thanks to HiiL and ODI for their work on the Justice Financing Framework and their excellent presentation. I'm sure there's much to discuss and lots to think about. So I think this is an excellent occasion for that discussion. I would also, of course, express my gratitude to be allowed to contribute from afar on behalf of OECD, and especially express our gratefulness to USAID for their generous support to the OECD work that was just announced in the opening on data and evidence for people-centered justice. We look forward to taking that forward, working with many of you around the table and in the virtual room. That work is of course connected to the Justice Action Coalition. And we're very happy to be able to contribute to that. So I will say a few words first on how this work that was just presented aligns with OECD work on people-centered justice, including in the context of the Justice Action Coalition, and what we see as sort of the important new areas of exploration and collaboration, particularly in the context of achieving the SDGs, and then share some thoughts on the presentations and its key insights. So firstly, the OECD has been working on improving access to justice in its member and partner countries for many years, working through country programs, our annual roundtable, policy analysis, development of tools and methodologies, and of course, alongside many partners, including those here today, in the context of the global efforts that were sparked by the adoption of SDG 16 in 2015. This work from OECD, together with partners, culminated in 2023 in the adoption of the recommendation. This is the recommendation of the Council on Access to Justice and People-Centered Justice Systems. It was already mentioned. And we believe and hope and will work to make it so that this recommendation will really have significant input both in OECD member countries on their domestic side, hopefully also in their international policies. And we're happy to announce, although it's not that new anymore, many people have heard it in the meantime, Swati also mentioned it, that the European Union has now also adopted this or endorsed this recommendation, I should say, adhered to it in the formal legal language, which means it is now part of EU acquis communautaire, which is binding on EU member states. And that's just to say that this notion of people-centered justice, I think, is here to stay and is something that will drive reforms, discussions, hopefully policy discussions, but also financing discussions for years to come. We also believe that this topic is more important than ever, particularly in the broader context, some of which is being heavily discussed in New York now in the context of the Summit of the Future, the pressures on democracy, the trust that people have or lack in public institutions, and the rule of law, threats to the rule of law. So again, in that context, people-centered justice is a key approach to use. And this financing framework is really an important step forward to making that a reality, to translating those ideas and those policy approaches, those reforms into reality in countries around the world. So Marcus asked 3 questions. Is a new approach needed? Is this framework a useful first step? And are there any elements missing? So I will say a few words on those in response to those questions. So yes, I do believe a new framework or a new approach is needed. And there really is much to do in this area for all of us, whether we are working domestically or internationally. And I also believe this is an important and useful first step. So as was said, the need for increased funding is recognized, but the empirical evidence that was presented here and also that OECD has gathered shows that the strategic allocation of resources and efficient spending are at least as important as raising the resources or increasing investments. On the slide that we just saw that Marcus presented, that there is this strong consistency in terms of the percentage of the budget spent. And the fact that it doesn't necessarily, more investment doesn't necessarily lead to better rule of law outcomes. And that, I believe, is where people-centered justice comes in. Are those resources being spent in the most efficient and effective way to achieve the priority outcomes? No one is denying, by the way, that there are more, that the justice sector needs sufficient resources. And the OECD recommendation also, of course, states that, as well as that we need more transparency in justice budgeting. But we also need a better connection. I think this is really the key, and that's what we're trying to establish with the framework, a better connection of the resources to the priorities for the sector and a stronger evidence base around efficiency and effectiveness. And yes, we not only need to invest more, we need to spend the resources more wisely. So some key ideas on this framework then. So these connections that I believe are important between outcomes, priorities, effectiveness, costing, and resourcing, which is indeed a useful first step for these discussions. All of them merit much more work, and of course the framework provides for that. But some that I find particularly useful is in the effectiveness, Marcus mentioned the R&D function. This is part of the people-centered justice approach, that policies and implementation are evidence-based and data-driven, and yet the justice sector invests very little in research and development, especially compared to health, but also to education. And not many countries have a structural, embedded and well-funded R&D function for the justice sector. So I think that's one element I wanted to pick out. The other is the outcomes. Now, of course, it's easy to say, let's identify some three or to five outcomes. I think that is actually a very, very big discussion, both domestically and internationally. And it connects to other work that OECD is doing on the measurement framework and developing key indicators for people-centered justice. The third one is planning against available resources. This is, I think, of critical importance. Again, it doesn't sound complicated, but we have in the justice sector, I think, a tradition of saying we need more resources, we need more investment because we want to do this, and we plan from a normative framework of everything that we believe should be done, everything that even our constitutions and our justice systems or legal systems guarantee. But we don't start from the available resources and plan out from there. So that turning around, I think that this framework is a basis for to really begin with what resources are available or can reasonably be expected to become available, and how can we then optimize our investment and the use of those resources. And that ties it very much to the point that was also mentioned under the priorities. This concept of what are best buys, how do you use the resources really to optimum effect and to achieve outcomes for people most efficiently. So I think those are some of the core ideas that this justice framework offers that are important. Again, lots to be developed. But you know, that's it's a first step. So lastly, I would just say in terms of what's missing, I don't think in this framework per se there's a component missing. I do think that in developing this framework, it's important to keep in mind that such changes in countries' budgetary procedures are not easy to make. It's a long-term process requiring deep engagement with experts and practitioners and civil servants in justice ministries, in finance ministries around the world, and experts working on public sector budgeting. So in terms of what's missing, there's a lot of work to be done. And then the final thing I'd like to say is that there is other work, connected work, that's being done, and that the OECD will initiate. It was mentioned briefly by Marcus on the slide. This is related to the business case. So some of you may know that there was some work done earlier by the OECD on understanding the cost of the global justice gap, the impact of unresolved justice problems. There was a white paper published in 2019 that demonstrated that in OECD countries, a conservative estimate was that the fact that there were so many unresolved justice problems had an impact on countries' GDP of 0.5 to 3%. So that number is still out there. We are planning to do more work in that area. As part of the efforts of the Justice Action Coalition, we will be developing 4 country-level business case studies to better understand those costs and help make the case for much more efficient and effective justice sectors across the board. So these 2 pieces of work, I think, will really complement each other and hopefully reinforce each other. And so we look forward to working with all of you in this important area. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maaike. Before I open the floor for questions, just wanted to mention, if people heard Jack, it's no one's best friend. It's the short form for Justice Action Coalition. We all end up using acronyms. So Justice Action Coalition is often referred to as Jack. But also I'll open up the floor for discussion, but let me also introduce my fellow moderator. Since this is a hybrid session, we will be moderating together, Clare and I. Clare is joining us online, and Clare, Manuel, as was already introduced, is the better half. I agree because she's a lawyer. Clare is a senior research associate for the Politics and Governance program at ODI. She's a lawyer specializing in access to justice, financing for justice, business enabling environment, women in business, institutional strengthening, legal reform, and adaptive programming, with over 25 years of experience of research, policy, and programming. So what we'll do is Clare will moderate any questions that come up online, and I can moderate the questions that are raised here so please feel free to raise your hands, real or virtual, and we can take it up from there. And please do raise your hands because we've kept 1 hour for this discussion. Please.
I'm Dr. Yael Danieli. I represent the International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. One of our most important sections is the section on reparative justice. And the word reparative doesn't just mean about reparations, but it stems from repair. Okay, I've had the honor of, for the last 45 years, to be involved in developing and adapting all victims' rights-related instruments. And this discussion makes me very nostalgic. Today's, for example, in 1991, when we were working on the reparations resolution with Theo van Boven, another Dutchman. And everyone, as always in these discussions, was either a lawyer or a judge. And I was the only non-lawyer and judge, a psychologist, a trauma specialist who's worked with victims all these years. And at some point, and each one of them presented what they think. And at some point I asked, has anyone asked victims what they believe is justice, what justice means to them? And Theo said to me, well, would you take that on? And of course I said yes. And it led me to an international study of what justice means to victims and what victims themselves consider necessary elements for the fulfillment of justice. What is amazing to me in this discussion, Marcus, is that you came to the same conclusion that I came to in 1991. This is many years ago. Which means healing from the kind of traumas we are talking about in international justice or national justice takes all disciplines. The way I formulated it was from the individual point of view, from the societal point of view, from the national point of view, and from the international point of view. Okay, so we should actually sit together for a day and sort of compare notes as to what direction we came to what. And in some ways, when it comes to financing, we're actually saving a lot when we think multidisciplinarily and multi-sectorially, rather than just call it justice. You need healing. You need not only education, but educations on all levels, in school, on television, and whatever access people. You know what? Most victims or perpetrators around the world don't even know that victims have rights. So I'm talking about education, not just, in school.
Absolutely.
And on, with the rehabilitation.
Ma'am, can I ask you to keep
Okay,
comments?
sorry.
No, please.
It's 50 years work.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So what I'm saying is, so we are in a wonderful point. Next year is the 40th anniversary of the Victim Declaration. And the 20th anniversary of the reparations resolution. We are actually planning for this. So I invite the coalition, in fact, I would like to be a part of it, to celebrate it with us. Because, you sort of got the field when HiiL got into people-centered justice. We were about victims-based justice. Okay, looking at justice from the victim's point of view. And thinking of it, not only individual victims, as I said, but the society, right? The community, the family. Because when we don't have justice, the trauma stays with the individual lifelong. Not only it goes from generation to generation. And justice is timeless also. Okay, so we really have to take a multi-generational point of view and not just think technically. I took lots of notes and I will stop. I know, I will stop.
Just trying to
I
ensure
just
that
wanted
everyone.
to say I'm extremely excited with this conversation because finally we're talking about the same thing. The world of justice, not only justice in the courtroom.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll also remind everyone of the 3 questions. I don't know, Claire, is it possible to put, Claire, I'm saying, can you, Leah? I was looking at Claire, but Leah, can we put those questions back up for discussion also if possible? The 3 questions, as you know, are, and of course, feel free to give any other comments, but is this approach something that do you believe that we need a new approach to financing? Does this draft make sense? Is it the right way to start? Are there things that are missing from this framework? I know there was a question there or a comment.
Comment perhaps. Thank you. My name is Julie Van Dassen. I'm with UNDP. I'm recently in New York, just same as Theresa. I've got a strong program background in countries, and I've done 20 years of management work of rule of law projects in very different contexts, ranging from South Sudan to Indonesia to Malawi, which I think Marcus brought up as well. I think it's a really great framework, but for me, there's a bit of an elephant in the room for application, and that is corruption. The slide that you had where you were looking at justice investments versus justice delivery, let's say, or performance, I really think that that would be interesting to triangulate against corruption indices, because unlike health and education, particularly police, but justice sector officials, judges as well, of course, they have a power dynamic with their constituents that other service providers don't have. And depending on the amount of oversight and actual control the central government has in the regions, when you're really looking at people-centered justice and access to justice in remote areas, you can have everything from completely under-equipped, illiterate police officers who don't know laws and have the power and therefore become instruments in community dynamics that are beyond justice. But you also can very easily get, somebody within government to sign off on their commitment to something if they're not walking the walk as well as talking the talk. That as long as they see some sort of financing or funding behind it, they would be willing to sign off and get that started. So I think that's something that needs to be considered in the criteria when you're approaching new countries, and also as potential mitigation measures when you're looking at financing. And I've only just stepped into the JAC kind of portfolio with UNDP, taken over from Maaike, who some of you may know. But I think that the fact that there is, from the funding institutions, oversight also at country level and interaction and support at country level, that's a really great first step. But I just wanted to point that out because I really do think that it influences the impact a lot.
Thank you. Remind, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. I don't want UNDP after another. So my name is Reva Holbeck. I'm also with the UNDP rule of law team. And again, thank you so much, Theresa, Marcus, also Clare online, for presenting this framework. And I think in terms of going through the questions, absolutely, yes, you definitely need a new approach. I think we've worked in the area of access to justice, rule of law for many, many years. And of course, a lot of frustrations sometimes around what we need to be able to achieve, but some of it goes back to the idea that, or the reality rather, that sometimes we don't have enough resources. Mm-hmm. Of course, juxtaposing this reality against a dwindling set of resources, both at international level and at national level, the idea of a framework where we are really talking about effectiveness and efficiency absolutely makes sense. The one point that I wanted to say, Marcus, is it's quite striking to see this consistent over a period of 20 or so years of investments, right, in justice or in policing across the board. I was just wondering with other sectors, right, health, education, where we have seen improvement, to say how much of an increase, for example, in investment was done. I'm not sure whether when you were doing the analysis and the comparison, you were able to see, and whether that is a piece of information or statistical data evidence that we can also use to argue for that increase. I know for sure we are cautiously doing this, knowing that perhaps there will not be an increase, but rather we need more efficiency. So, that is point number one. And point number two for me relates to the point about demonstrating our results. So more specifically, to say, yes, when it comes to the justice outcomes and the examples that we have given, makes a lot of sense, but I think we may need to take it a little bit further, right, in terms of saying, how does the resolution of these 15 million justice disputes relate to the improvement of, let's say, the socio-economic rights of the people that have been affected? How does that then translate into the bigger socio-economic picture of a country? And how does that build up? I know the point that Clare mentioned also on GDP, because I think there is something which is almost intangible, right, about the results sometimes under rule of law and justice in comparison to health and education. And I think it is about how we are able to continue to demonstrate that and link it to the financing and the effectiveness and the prioritization, which I think is critically important. I know it's a tough one, but I think it's one of those that we need to consistently keep in mind. I'll stop here for now, and I think it's we can always have more conversations, I'm sure, in terms of also bringing to the table some of UNDP's experiences also in the field. Thanks.
Would you want to react now, or I also have a little theme which I can come to a bit later.
There was one question online. Do you want to take that as well?
Was there?
Is there an online question or not?
Claire, is there an online question?
So one's just been put up. I'll just read it out. What are the hopes of pressurizing donor countries and institutions to allocate more funding for justice in the light of research showing the decline in justice share of aid, and in contrast to ever increasing expenditures in defense? So that's kind of a reality check. And that was from Sohila Komninos. So I don't know if someone would like to respond to that.
Yes, maybe doing block of questions then.
Is maybe I'll pick up the right point and just say, can I just understand if there is a subtle difference with the point we made at what I made in my opening remarks about ensuring accessible, efficient, and equitable justice is laying the foundation for all of the economic and social, so thriving business environment, attractive investment, fostering, enhancing public trust in institutions, but also a lot more around peace, stability, all of those. Is there something in what you're saying that is going something more, and could you just unpack that so we capture it?
Sure, absolutely. I think the point is, we are completely agreed, I think, in terms of what you are saying. I think the point is really about now then demonstrating the results. So for example, one could pick country X, where we can then be able to say in country X, these investments were done, and this is the levels of efficiency and effectiveness, and as a result, we can actually see. And I think because sometimes those results are not so visible, and I think it's something which we all commonly share, that is also sometimes where then the doubts in terms of investments, do come in.
Clear, thank you.
And I just want to say, yes, non-lawyers should certainly talk to each other. So we should talk afterwards just on that basis. But no, more seriously, yes, it'd be very interesting to learn what the 40-year experience of victim-centered approaches has, because as you say, there are lots of echoes with the people-centered approach. So learning from your experience across that time period would be very interesting. Julie, on UNDP, absolutely, very good call out. It made me think some earlier drafts, we did have a whole block talking about accountability and oversight. And I think that should definitely come in. But your point also about, if you're going to give countries some money, you need to be thinking about the overall governance of that country and to what extent their commitments are credible to what they might do. I don't think there's going to be a lot of money on the table, but that's no problem. And then, Ravi, thank you. So we've not yet done much work on what the share of health and education has been over time. My anecdotal evidence is that health has increased, and that's certainly true in OECD, and it's certainly true in low-income countries. And it would be interesting to do a political economy analysis of why that's happened. And one of the things we want to do is actually do a deeper dive into that, and we're discussing about funding for that. The question about, and your offer to contribute will be so welcome. I mean, all the work you're doing with the Catholic funds. I mentioned the Columbia House of Justice, of course, UNDP scaled that up in lots of other countries. I was reading just recently about having a Guinea-Bissau. I mean, there's an enormous richness. I also know you're incredibly busy doing other things, but any time you can spare to do that would be so welcome, because all the UNDP is working in that side. And then the question from the online, in the framework, you'll find buried in some of the more detailed documents, We have expressed, should there be an ambition for aid to have 2% of justice aid, the justice should have 2% of aid, down to 1. Should we collectively say and make the case for saying this? I mean, education makes a claim that 20% I think is of aid should go for education. So would that be a helpful way forward? Is that a realistic target? To my mind, the main case for saying if the OECD countries spend 4% of their budgets on justice, why, when they come to spend their aid, they only give 1% of their budgets for justice? And there's a disjoint between what they're spending at home and what they're spending abroad. So I think, and particularly given their partner countries are spending 6% of their money on budgets. I mean, they clearly think it's important. So there's some disjoint there of the numbers. I'm wondering whether there's a way through on that. So, of course, we haven't talked about whether aid is going up or down, and defence is obviously making a claim on that. But I certainly think it's worth shooting for. In the short term, I'm not realistic given what I know about general budget cuts that are happening all over the world. But I think part of it will be, you and I, Clare, were talking earlier that we need to demonstrate results. We need to demonstrate cost effectiveness. There actually is not merely saying this is an important thing. We've also got to have a program that demonstrates results and changes. And we haven't got a lot of evidence for that. We have put it in places. We need to surface that more. But I think in general, people think justice doesn't work and it's too difficult. And I think we've got to change that narrative. Yeah.
I think that's right. And I think, Martin, your slide, which was showing those percentages, right? Because human rights, right? And also sort of gender-based violence sort of staying the same. It's really this other section of how to work with judiciary, rule of law, I think that's correct, that it's this feeling that it hasn't worked. And it's really, that's what this framework, I think, is helping us think about, is this a way forward for that, which then you could make a case for increased resource. Yeah.
So back to you as our moderator.
Thank you. I know, Tema, you have received some questions, and I'll call upon you, but there was just one thing that was coming to me also listening to Julie. I think your name, Julie, right? So, I mean, and it's not really related to whether the framework reads good to me, but do you think there might be questions around, is this based in reality, right? Is it disconnected from reality? Are we doing some work which doesn't take into account the political economy? And I understand that the purpose is that this is a framework for those who are actually willing to make the pivot. We can't use this framework and go into a country where you have a dictator not wanting to do things or a corrupt government not wanting to do things. It's a framework of the willing, so to say, right? Or so I understand. But also, do you think, I mean, I was just thinking in terms of both opportunities and risks. One risk, do you think, could be that the framework could be used by not so nice forces to undermine independence of judiciary, for example, at points saying, there is this emerging research saying that you don't work, and therefore we will not give money to you. You shouldn't remain, you become another, we know what's happening in Mexico. The other is those who want to use this framework will have serious challenges from elites, including judges and lawyers. And we know how politics works across contexts. It will be, whoever is not in favor, a justice minister who wants to change things will be faced by opposition forces who will say they are going to now disband judiciary, they are going to take away lawyers' jobs. And should we be thinking about, maybe not in the framework, as part of also broadly as part of the coalition, but definitely having tools with ministers who want to move the dial on how to manage the communications around some of this. So if the moment you introduce new policies, we know that there are going to be, in the current context, questions that are going to be raised, which are going to kind of twist it on its head and present it in a different manner. And how do we meet some of those challenges? How do we meet challenges that we will get from lawyers' lobbies who say our jobs are going now, they're saying, customary informal justice, and to think through some of those linkages. Maybe it's not the job of the framework, but at least to be mindful that these are things that we'll have to think through.
I was just going to say, I can come back to that as a question, but I'm having a conversation with Erica in the World Bank about some science issues. So I know Erica is due to do a wrap up, but this is a call out to Erica, if you want to come in at this point at some point, just say, well, what World Bank's thinking and planning, because World Bank is well used to reform and political economy challenges across the pitch. But I'll leave Erica to decide when she wants to put up a hand.
And also on corruption. I mean, I think that's definitely, you know, a big thing for the World Bank. So we do see it come up in all of their documentation. This emphasis on ensuring transparency, accountability, you know.
Well, and it affects reforms in two different ways, right? Because this is why I said walk. Honestly, the only place I've ever seen really great police reforms that benefited the people was in Aceh after the tsunami, when basically Aceh.
Actually,
But it was
yeah.
when you'd lost 130,000 people and
Yeah.
all of those people in power, majority of them were gone. And you were bringing in really a new way of thinking from the leadership that was then pushed down through promotions and therefore infiltrated the entire institution. But in other places, Malawi being the most recent where I've been, you can have a minister of justice or a chief of police saying that this is the reform they want to make, and they will get literal threats. As soon as you start affecting people's livelihoods and suggesting that they might not be able to get the income that they're used to getting, you know, these treats of getting on traffic police or getting in customs, this is a reward to people in your family in a lot of countries, right? And so it really, it's beyond just one person saying that they want to do it. It's really, that's why I said walking the walk. As soon as you see that they're actually starting to implement this, push it down, and it's starting to work, that's when I think investment is most important to support that person in pushing through that initiative.
Absolutely, and I just two sentences on this. I think some of the are bright spots as well, because you know, if we're realistic, as Swati is saying, if we're realistic about political economy and just the challenges of trying to get this to work at country level, we are seeing some very bold leadership stepping up. And we have two cases of that, at least at HiiL, in Ethiopia and in Nigeria, in Kaduna State, which is in the north. You know, where it is impossibly difficult because of conflict and security and so many other challenges. But this shifting of accountability away from the formal sector to people in the communities. So you're now facing away from those that hold the money first, or the money strings, so to speak, and have this power dynamic towards people and really designing for that intentionally. So there are rights. I just wanted to highlight that.
We have two questions in the room, and I think a question which has come online from Maaike. So can we start with the room? Can you please?
Thank you. My name is Carter. I'm a judicial affairs officer with the Justice and Corrections Service in the Department of Peace Operations. I just wanted to build on, I think, some of the comments that people have been saying. I think that one of the things that may be missing, and it builds on what Julie was saying as well, is the mindset of the actors, particularly when we're talking about people-centered justice, that it's also not just the mindset of the donors, but the mindset of the lawyers, of the judges, of the police, of the prison, and whether or not, and perhaps this is where you know, some historical or analogous work could be done on behavioral science or aspects of behavioral change or these kinds of things that really might impact the relevance, because I think it's also I assume there will be kind of pilot cases, and based on those, then that will help make the case. And so if those pilot cases are in fact impacted by things outside of what we're talking about, it might be relevant to take them into account. In leading towards that, a kind of a risk mitigation kind of approach might be able to be useful to add to the framework in some sense.
Sunil, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, thank you. And it's been a very interesting discussion. I feel like I need a day or two just to absorb a lot of what what's come our way to properly contribute to this
Sunil, can you
discussion.
be a bit louder? So everybody-
Okay, I'll try and project a little louder. My question actually, or my comment is about the efficiency and effectiveness element of the framework, and to some extent echoing the comments from my colleague from UNDP. What I'm particularly interested in is impact, right? So not necessarily number of cases concluded or even the speed, but rather how that has impacted the ultimate beneficiaries as a means in which to assess the effectiveness of the mechanism that may be developed or adapted to be people-centered, and how that's done, and the importance of a consultative approach, engaging the end users, whether they're survivors or parties to a civil dispute or whatever the case may be, but understanding the impact of that process. On the one hand, to make the business case, but also as a means in which to promote, right? I understand that the framework is directed at the national level, but I think it's also something that could be used to promote the people-centered justice approach itself, right? I'm reminded of the voluntary national review of Sierra Leone, in which they talked about the provision of legal aid. And they had done an assessment, a poll, if you like, of the beneficiaries that had received that. And it wasn't about, you know, the fact that the case was concluded, but the psychological impact that a conclusion to their dispute had on their general well-being. That kind of information, linking it to things like health, is critically important in making the case of how impactful people-centered justice can be. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily something that has been considered in Section 3, but it's something that perhaps could be given some consideration or weight.
You guys are
Thanks, Sunil. There's a question online, and then maybe we can take them together. Claire, I'm sorry that you're not getting hands from the online people, and they're sometimes sending comments in writing, but I can read the online question, or Claire, you can read it, whatever you prefer.
Okay, I'll read it out for you. It'd be really helpful actually if you could put up the slide on the aid allocations to answer this. So Maaike was asking about the decrease in donor funding. It's the next slide actually. The next one will be good. And about the main decrease is legal and judicial development. That's the blue bit in the on the slide. And Maaike says, of course, people-centered justice broadens the understanding of the justice sector to include a wide range of justice actors beyond the formal legal system. So she asked, do we know if donors supporting people-centered justice programs would still label them as legal and judicial development? So if a donor was going to, I don't know, support paralegals, for example, would that be categorized in the official aid categorizations as legal and judicial development? Is the question.
Simple answer, yes.
Yeah.
Partly because it's the bucket for everything that isn't human rights or any violence against women and girls. And also because there are examples of where it is being recorded as that already. So that was a quick one.
But do you also want to then kind of respond to questions that were asked?
Yes, so just to say, really good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. I think we've found, but these are the pilots that we're going to demonstrate the case. So I love the input coming up. We found introducing elements in pilots that are culturally relevant, that have the symbolic meaning that is closer to the culture of the people, rather than putting your hands on a Bible and swearing to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. That changes something. And language that puts emphasis on establishing the truth as opposed to right and wrong, repairing and restoring relationships, putting the emphasis on that rather than punitive, punishing the wrongdoer. These subtle changes seem to be making a difference. Yeah, so thank you for just highlighting that. That's really important to bring out as well. Yeah.
Sorry, just wanted to, I don't know, Sunil, but your question was also going one step beyond, I think, saying that are we focusing on outcomes as opposed just to, you know, and I think that the framework will be, and the 6 principles, the first one is around outcomes and not just focused on
Yeah.
access to legal aid, but like, were you able to resolve your problem rather than, you know, access to courts and access to formal systems, going beyond that.
So I think one thing we need to distinguish is this framework is for JAC countries that want to pivot towards this way. So therefore the assumption is, that's it. If the issue is about what's the business case and how can we persuade more countries to join them, that I feel like is a separate research project. So where I do think that there is a mapping definitely is that we would need to, I think it increases the need for having research being done at a country level, having research institutes, because this kind of impact study is really difficult to do. I think it's very important, but it's difficult to do. But it's only going to be done if we can do it at a country level. It's great that Sierra Leone has done that, but there aren't that many. So I think it carried on. So, shall I go with some other questions that came in that round as well? So, Swati, I know we talked about the independence of the judiciary. Could the JFF be misused? I doubt somehow or other that the president of Mexico will look at the study and think, aha, I'm not putting enough pressure on changing and reducing the. So I hope, that, yeah. I think that's a really humble thing. It might not be used on that, but we should be alert to that. I think you raise a separate issue, which is about, given the independence of the judiciary is so important, how do you ensure you're engaging this kind of room? And I remember a conversation actually Clare had in a country we were working in, where she got everyone in the room, and the first 24 hours was literally a conversation that the judge was having with everyone else, saying, I can't be in this room, because it's constitutionally barred from this. And by the end of it, I said, actually, this is really good. We're sort of a justice family, aren't we? You know, we do need to work together to deliver justice. So anyway, these things can. You also raised the issue about challenges from elites. Again, I think this comes back to the political economy, and maybe we should try and add that into it, because we should have we cannot overstate how difficult this is going to be. You know, Sierra Leone, which we all held up as being a great example using paralegal, it took them 20 years to get there. And there was a story about civil society starting it up and demonstrating the way. It was World Bank who supported them. It was philanthropists who supported them. That took 10 years. Then there was 5 years of advocacy and change, again, some smart supporters helping the then Attorney General to make the case. Smart Sierra Leone's getting up saying, look, here's the evidence. Isn't going to destroy the justice, isn't going to destroy the lawyers' livelihood, because you aren't here and the problems is at any rate. So, why are you worried? Yeah, it took a long time. And in Malawi, which is probably one of the countries that first started the paralegal movement in a very serious way, they're still not formally approved in Malawi. So, it's going to take a lot of challenge. Whether we can do a to-do manual how to solve that, I don't know. But,
Yeah, but can I also come back to you on that, particularly Sierra Leone's example, right? Sierra Leone has about 300 lawyers in Freetown.
Yeah.
So it doesn't face the same kind of resistance from lawyers that it will face in the United States or in India, where you have enough lawyers and they don't have enough work, and they are like, here at least the lawyers are very expensive. In India, you can get cheap lawyers. So you will have strong resistance. In Myanmar, where I was working, lawyers had such a strong, and you know that, I'm not telling you anything new, right? But just to think through people who are willing to make the change, ministers who are willing to go forward, what tools will they have and in their hand to actually be able, because it's not only about having the right policies, we have seen that in separate occasions across contexts, green transitions, we know what happens, right? So we need to be able to think through tools on how you manage, how you bring people together, and just be able to give those tools to ministers.
I mean, the other thing.
The financing framework, because we have to get.
Yeah.
I mean, the good piece of news that I was quoting someone was, we're looking at Argentina, which I think is going to be another cost-effective example, access justice centers. And you're saying to them, they use lawyers. And I said, well, didn't you think you're using paralegals? Actually, in Argentina, you could be publicly funded to be trained as a lawyer. There's then no bar exam you've got to pass to become a lawyer. So actually, those are quite cheap. And again, we documented one in Tajikistan, where because of the Soviet system, there actually were quite a lot of lawyers around. So actually, the distinction between a paralegal payment and a lawyer's payment wasn't that great, whereas in Sierra Leone and other countries. So I think we also should be agnostic about, whatever works. If you can make this work in a cost-effective way, you don't need to use paralegals, great. In some countries, maybe really, if this is the only way, you're really going to have to take it off. But yeah, so the Julie, I mean, you mentioned, I think this is picking up exactly the same point. You know, when you have a crisis in that can then prompt change. And if you don't have a crisis, then it's difficult sometimes to happen that. We should talk about police reform. I agree, there are very few sustained examples of police reform, but I would love to talk to you about what Court Aid have done in DRC, if that's not already on your radar, because I think that's possibly an example. And yeah, Nicole, I mean, coming back to your point, we haven't, I should just say, actually, we have downpedaled a bit what we say about police here. And this is partly because there's an institutional problem here, that some people in this room can't be engaged with police reform because they're barred by US Congress or because they're barred by being a shareholder of the World Bank. So we've got to, have something that works for both. But I agree, maybe we should think more about the police, and I agree then behavioural reform and how you engage on that would be so important, and advising people about a risk mitigation strategy. I think that could be a neat way, of at least doing something very practical to engage in that. And Sunil, yeah, these issues of impact it's so important. And how we hold ourselves accountable. I mean, is the ultimate measure going to be a survey need that comes out and we actually have reduced the gap? That we've suddenly got not 50% of people who've got no support, but actually only 25%. How are we going to measure? And that's how we measure in the SDG. That's how we've set ourselves up at the moment. Is that the right way to do it? I don't know, but that's just the sort of thing. It'd be great to talk to IDEA about it.
I think there is, so if I just need to come back on some of the comments, the pro-value comments you made, there was a dual purpose to my initial comments. I think those of us who are working in the advocacy and policy space are constantly looking for data and evidence that backs up or supports this idea of people-centered justice. That's one element of it. But even within the territory, this idea of monitoring impact, it's about two-way conversations and recognizing that what is people-centered is an emerging concept, right? It can change. And it's important that you don't have these top-down structures, especially in societies that have more formal justice systems, which are traditionally top-down and don't often work for the large swathes of populations. So it's important that there is that periodic communication with end users, with beneficiaries, to understand if the system's working. And if it doesn't, you adjust the mechanism according to necessarily the will of the people. So there's two elements to it, but I mean, ensuring that you understand whether your people-centered justice mechanism, bespoke or adapted, is actually working.
Yeah. Henkion, Maggie, you, Alvin. So 5 questions,
Apologies for coming late. I was in the negotiations on the Pact for the Future. They will get there. But my name is Henkion Brinkman. I'm the Permanent Observer for the International Development Law Organization, working with Sunil. So, and I'm sorry if this was already discussed, but financing for development is also coming up. And I was involved in the Pathways for Peace report, and one of the most quoted numbers out of that report probably was the $1 in prevention saves $16 down the line. You can criticize that methodology quite a bit, but it's quoted again and again. Do we have such a number for investment in the justice sector? Not so much the prevention, but some cost effectiveness idea of $1 invested in the justice sector solves X number of justice needs for X number of people, something like that. I think it's an important advocacy tool going into finance for development and et cetera.
Michael.
Hi, great. Thank you so much. My name is Hannah Williams. I work with Swati and Pathfinders. I just had a quick question on this point that's been raised by a few people of how you actually support the change makers at national level, the people that are willing to kind of stick their necks out. And to this end, my question is, so how do you do this? What type of investment is needed by whom across what types of sectors? And with what degree of involvement of civil society at national and local levels, but also the utility of them providing a platform for those change makers at global, regional and international fora. So like, how useful is that? And how often should that be kind of provided and presented in order to kind of sustain the support that's required to see these things, to see actual progress and made despite the odds and the challenges that are faced also by people whose livelihoods are kind of wrecked at all levels. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to clarify. I mean, my discussion about behavior change in mind and mindset wasn't just about police. It was about everybody, including judges, and even when we're looking towards customary leaders, you know, in customary courts, and actually having them understand the role that they are playing, and that the beneficiaries of their work should be centered, people centered, or you know, putting the beneficiaries first, because that's not necessarily true beyond just police. So I think that that's something that I think also goes towards what Swati was saying as well. How do we implement this, particularly for those change makers?
Yeah, just to share one pearl and to ask one question. One pearl in terms of the outcome. I'm not the poetic kind. In our work in Bosnia, Herzegovina, which was supported by Germany actually, I just called it promoting a dialogue. The people themselves who we were training and working with changed the name to democracy cannot be built with the hands of broken souls. So put that as the outcome to look for. But the other thing I wanted to throw out as a question to governments is what happens if you don't invest in justice? Okay, it's untold cost for generations. So the issue is not only how much money we put in, how we put it and where we put it, is if you don't, what are you are actually planning the next war, the next crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So we should always have that question also, particularly when we talk about government and about funding.
So,
2 questions from that.
So thank you. My name is Ada Obi Eboka. I direct the Africa program of the Cyrus RMS Center for International Justice. I'm also from Nigeria. So just a few things to point out as I listen to others is when we talk about people-centered justice, are we able to look at models that we can see that has worked? So based on those models, we can then think about what worked, what didn't work, what lessons can be learned, and then that's shared with others. Because bearing in mind that when we are all talking about outcomes, that has been the issue we have seen with a lot of donors, where the major attention is on outcome and not the process. Realizing that when it comes to legal issues and people-centered issues, the outcomes are not very tangible. You really can't see them immediately, and that's what affects a lot of local organizations who are working, because donors are fixated on outcomes, and that then drives the approach within which you see a lot of NGOs who are working on ground through their work. And when I hear that this is a lot on the national level, I also worry, because you might have, like Julia raised at the back, you may have a minister who is very interested, who is passionate, he starts it, and then 2 years down the line, he has to leave. What happens? Because that's a big thing that we also have to look at. Should we look at it from a very local perspective and then drive the model that we see come out as something that can be modeled in other places? Where does prevention come into place here? What lessons are we using to look at prevention as an approach, and not just looking at people-centered justice as when there's an issue? Because there are things that could also be preventative that can be needed. And we're also looking at those kind of issues. Talking about data, I worry because data is something that is hard to figure out now. And that's why I talk about models. If we're able to pilot specific models in different countries, and then we can then draw out what has worked from them, then we can talk about data. Because I realized from my work in Kenya that a lot of these issues that we're talking about are not really focused in the courts. The people-centered justice you're looking at as something that sometimes it's just somebody reviewing agreements, sometimes it's just a meeting, it's not just really the legal system itself. So there are various dynamics that we must take into consideration. These are just very few points I wanted to point out.
Thank you so much.
I'll try to be quick too. And I apologize, I have another engagement at 12, so I would love to talk with people more, but maybe at a different time. I want to try and be constructive. I really like the input about going to the people and doing the perception survey. My first thoughts when that came up was, you know, how expensive those are. However, investing in justice in a way that doesn't have any results is more expensive. And I really think that my experience when we've been most successful at transforming things is when we've done the perception survey. First, found out where people get their justice or where they go for justice, who they trust, a trust barometer, you know. Edelman, this global PR firm, has a really great methodology for looking at trust that could be applied or be slightly tailored to be applied at that level as well. But anyway, it's that 100% would go past, because when we look at data, the other thing about data is you don't get data from the people who need justice most, from the people who we should be focusing on most in people-centered justice. It doesn't come up, it's not collected at that level. It's not represented in the high level big data kind of numbers. And so really making sure that you have taken them into account when you through a perception survey that's very specific on the area you want to go into is important. And I just want to say, because Marcus, you brought up Langen, I'm sorry, I've just come from there as a head of governance. I've struggled with data there, I've struggled with everything there. Paralegals are something that is in Malawi, but this is why it's really important to know your context, because it took months before I've peeled off the onion and got people to admit things. They're only allowed to represent magistrates and prosecutors, and they are not allowed to function as defense lawyers because the lobby from the lawyers was so strong to not try and take away from what they have. And they change the head of the Legal Aid Bureau so frequently that they don't really have a good legislative advocacy or strong advocacy to change that legislation. So there are 24 lawyers in the Legal Aid Bureau, and they do everything that would be for paralegals. And they've got a really great, fast-talking CSO on paralegals, but they don't do anything with defense. They do, some kind of courts in the prisons and whatnot. So, anyway, sorry to get into the minutiae, but I just feel it's a really good example of when you need to know the details in order to be able to understand what exactly is going on, because there are a lot of levels of deceit. There's a lot of smoke around these things sometimes.
Rama, you wanted to comment?
Sure, thanks. Just one point. I want to just emphasize again on the point of the political economy considerations, I think in this work, and in particular, I was just thinking, of course, I mean, we are looking at other sectors for inspiration, right? In terms of what they've done, how they've done it, the results and the impact, that they have had. While at the same time, I'm also a bit worried about, to some extent, with the comparison, right? Knowing how justice, rule of law is much more political and much more sensitive. Not to say that in some instances, education or health are also not political or instrumentalized politically. Does happen, but perhaps to a much lesser extent in comparison. So the question is, as we do this analysis, how do we then put, I think, some of the, the thinking that will give us the opportunity to say, yes, we have inspiration from these sectors, but here are some of the differences, which perhaps may not make it equally applicable in this sector that we are talking about. So just again, within the framework of more robust political economy analysis. I was also gonna say to colleagues who may not be aware that, of course, within the work of the Justice Action Coalition, UNDP is responsible for administering a catalytic fund for work on people-centered justice at country level. And again, as part of connecting these work streams, we are really hoping that the framework, once completed and with all these nuances that are being brought in the room, we will be able to pilot also in a couple of countries where there is willingness and there's political will and leadership also of the government, perhaps through the Chief Justice or the Minister of Justice. And I think, again, perhaps at some point we'll be coming back, I think, perhaps to demonstrate the success or non-success of course, depending on how things roll out, but I think already we have an exciting opportunity, I think, through this coming together of this important way.
And just to say, for those worried about data, because it's come up 2 or 3 times, also to point you to the justice needs and satisfaction surveys that HiiL carries out in about 20 countries now. And that actually maps the justice journey, you know, it's about 6,000 respondents on average per country. So they go out and collect the data through face-to-face interviews. So that's also just encouraging you, they're all online, please read that. And I think the Jack fund that Raya just mentioned is going to support the one in Kenya, if I understand. So, yeah.
And also, for those who have not come across it, the World Justice Project has an atlas on their website of all the different justice needs surveys that have ever been done. So there is developed methodology on that. Before I hand it over to you very quickly, Mehta, and also on your question, just to flag that evidence on available, which is available on globally on return for investment on into justice. There was some evidence collected globally by the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice as an input to the task force report in 2019. Of course, it's dated, but the report is called Investing in Justice, and we can share links to that. But again, there have been other questions, Marcus, which were referring to collecting data on why invest in justice and the risks of not investing in justice. And I think OECD's work also under Workstream 1, where they're looking at the business case on justice, will be looking at that.
Yeah.
But I hand over back to you.
So thank you, and Andrew, I mean, it's a really key point. I fully agree that 1 to 16 was a really lovely number that keeps getting cited. And I do think that what I would like to see, one of the research teams here is trying to document better how justice can deliver and support conflict prevention. So I think we've got it anecdotally. I think lots of us know it's true, but I don't think we've got the evidence base really to stand up the way that it needs to do. So I think we do need to strengthen the evidence, and that would help engage on that side. Maggie, we've had a lot of conversations interesting about how rather than what.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really big takeaway from me here. And to what extent can the justice financing framework map out the how as well as the what? But and maybe that is a key bucket we need to have including.
Yeah.
You know, the how is really important, not only the what. But I think you're right about how do we support change makers, and I think it's a really interesting aspect that I hadn't really thought about this. That goes beyond countries. You know, there is a case for community practice encouraging things. I know UNDP does work on that, getting regional people, I know IDLOs can be in West Africa and other places. So, you know, and my guess is those are important, and we should think about how important those are. So that's a really helpful point. Thank you. Nicole, I think the your point is fully taken. We need to talk about behavioural change and how do you manage that? How do you gauge? And picking up Ravaya, your point which related to that, I fully agree there are some differences. It's worth saying. You know, justice sector is much more political. There's a dynamics of power that are different. That said, I think there are some similarities. I mean, the doctors really didn't like community health workers, and the university chancellors really did not like their money taken away in order to give it to primary school teachers. So, there are common things, but that's also true whether you're talking about fire reform, a whole series of other sectors. So I think, the political economy, I think, is coming out very strongly from this on a variety of points. And your point as well, exactly about this issue about if you don't invest in justice, what then happens? And I think bringing it out, so it re-emphasizes, I think, what we're saying about conflict prevention. On the data, Julie, I fully agree. I think one of the problems is these perception surveys are expensive. And I think we need to find cheaper ways of doing it. And I think that should be one of our research topics. I mean, they are expensive, but also if you think about it, I mean, we did some calculations. If you allocated just 0.05% of justice aid to just doing justice service, we would suddenly have justice service everywhere. And as WJP Atlas is brilliant, but also it's got very few, there's a peak in the late 2010s, but very little's happened since then. And HiiL's nobly trying to do it, but, we need 155 of these happening every 3 years, not, we need to have a system that does that in the way that health does, exactly. So I think we really do need to crack how we do it, and there's problems of perception, how we measure, but we need to have a better measure and we need to have a process that actually guarantees you do that, and we should certainly bring that out in the financing framework more clearly in that respect. Yeah, let me stop there. I think there are multiple other questions that I've taken and engaged with, but I don't want to, if I respond to everyone, then we're going to hear, but I'm very happy to follow up with individuals outside of this. Swati, I know there's other questions queuing up from online, and I'm conscious you're trying to finish it by 12. So.
Yes, we have 5 minutes, and there were 2 questions that were shared by Gustavo Moreno. I think the first one, Gustavo, relates more to the business case which OECD is working on, but the second question I shall read. On what works, he's saying, if we consider people-centered justice as focusing on people developing the capabilities and having adequate access to support access to support, instruments, institutional mechanisms, and resources to autonomously recognize, handle, and solve their justice need, to what extent the researchers consider that countries, high income, middle income, and low income, have developed consistent, comprehensive, institutional, large-scale, people-centered systems, services that you can consider capable of providing that to general populations, especially to disadvantaged and marginalized communities.
I mean, I think this is a great question, because I think, Clare, you and I were talking about earlier, one of the other differences of the sector is that isn't an OECD country or a collection of OECD countries say they've solved it, they've got digital people-centered justice sorted, they don't have justice gaps. And this is one of the things that's been revealed, that actually everyone's got justice gaps. So I think there are countries which have made progress and which are worth highlighting. We've mentioned Colombia as being one of them. I think Sierra Leone, if you think the scale of the country, what they're doing is actually comparable to what was achieved in Colombia. So there are emerging 1 or 2 others, but in general, no. And I think that's one of the challenges, that we can't, point to. Adi, that was your point as well. We can't point to models that work. But this is precisely the point of this, to say, okay, well, let's point to the ones that we do know about, and let's try and think about how we get to that point, which is why research institutes or wider research is going to be so important. But I also think, we said we wanted to do this by next year. I think the sector is about 20 or 30 years behind the health sector. I don't think we're going to catch up in a year, but I do hope we can start today in these kinds of conversations about all of saying, this sector is so important, we need to treat it in the same degree of rigor that other sectors treat themselves. And I think that's, as a 20-year vision for, I hope we might want to try and set out. I think.
Can I just make one comment on that? Because I have worked also on the health issue, and I don't think we will ever get where the health sector is, because the science will never be as strong as in the health sector. And I think it's good to aim for that, in particular on cost effectiveness and all of that. But this kind of reforms in the justice sector or peace building in general, where I worked in, it will always remain an art as much as a science, and trial and error and context specific and adaptation to the political economy that Pravani mentioned. Of course, that also works in a way in the health sector. But when you vaccinate a child against measles, you know exactly how many lives you're going to save, and when a child gets malnourished, what the cost of that is, and that what kind of micronutrients a child needs between conception and the second birthday. And so we will never get there. I'm sorry, but I do think it's a good aim because they are the furthest ahead in many ways, also in funding. Which I don't think is unrelated. But anyway.
We should, I need to catch up on what I was saying earlier. It's not just purely that. I fully agree with you. We're not going to get into the evidence the same way. But I think in terms of their approach of thinking about primary health, which was quite revolutionary, but then had to go through, which I think we are undergoing as well. So I think there are some sectoral things we can. I agree. We're not going to work out what are the 23 most effective justice interventions. And engage in that kind of way. But that said, I think we can go a long way. I mean, just taking data seriously, just taking surveys seriously, just thinking about what are the outcomes rather than I need to strengthen this hospital, I need to train doctors better. Actually, people's lives and what's happening. So I think some of the revolution started, but I think we still.
No, I agree.
Theresa, last word to you, and then I will close the session because we have
Yes.
someone waiting.
Thank you, Swati. I just remembered that there was a comment on regional, national, international platforms, and just wanted to say, they are incredibly important, and the pace at which we go, mobilizing all of that also has to be driven by demand. So we also have to sometimes curb the instinct or impulse to go faster and bring it and convene in the convening. Because a lot of the time, they're asking for things to work on the ground. Let's see what works on the ground before we take them into the conversations, and start then working on the meeting. So just also saying it's incredibly important, but sometimes we have to resist the impulse to go faster than the demand for it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for a very, very rich discussion. Thank you both for your comments, but let me now invite Erica to provide the closing remarks. Erica Bosio, she is the Senior Public Sector Specialist with Governance Global Practice of the World Bank, where she leads the global initiative on justice and rule of law. Her research focuses primarily on justice reform, public procurement, reform design, and good governance. She joined the World Bank in 2012 and has held various roles in development economics vice presidency. Erica, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me well.
Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Swati. And thank you, everyone. It is great to be here today and to be able to contribute to this rich discussion on a topic that is really a top priority for the World Bank and seems to be a priority for many of the organizations and governments that are represented here today. Many thanks for inviting me also to close this event, and let me echo all of the other speakers' gratitude to our hosts and co-hosts for facilitating this exchange. And many thanks, of course, to Maaike and Theresa. I've had the opportunity to discuss the framework with them before, but it was also great to see their first presentation to a broader audience. And of course, it was fascinating to hear all of the different perspectives brought today. So I wanted to go back a bit to the questions that Marcus posed at the beginning of the session and remember what we wanted to achieve, right? So the main objectives today were to understand whether a framework was needed, as well as to map out some of its strengths and weaknesses in this first draft, what comes next. And I think the biggest highlight for me from this discussion was that there is a resounding yes to the fact that the framework is in fact needed. There seems to be consensus that there should be more joint effort on rethinking how we finance justice. And mainly for two reasons, I would say. First, justice financing sits at the very heart of JAC's commitment to address the global justice gap. And because it aligns with our collective view of pursuing people-centered justice, but also secondly, because it has the potential to help overcome some of the challenges that are often in the way of justice financing. And I'm thinking about judicial independence, institutional fragmentation, just to name a couple. And the financing framework has the promise to propose a new way to think about financing. In terms of strengths and areas that I still need some development, I think in terms of strengths, everyone seems to agree that this is refreshingly realistic to think about justice financing in terms of optimizing existing resources rather than expanding the resources. I think it was Swati that said planning against available money, and I think that's a very good way to put it. This is exactly where the framework seems to make a contribution, but also secondly makes a compelling case by drawing this analogy between justice on the one hand and health and education on the other. We may not get there, as our last contribution mentioned, but it is still a helpful way to rethink an area that otherwise has been somewhat stale. And to pick up on Marcus's point that the revolution in education and health took years to materialize. So even if this analogy helped shift the way that we think about financing, that in itself may be a useful contribution. as to some of what can come next on the financing framework, some of the ideas that came out of the discussion today really resonated with me, and I wanted to pick up on three that were common amongst the various speakers. And the first one was on political economy. So different discussants came to this point in different ways. Some from building the buy-in, some from the corruption, but the point remains of how do we make sure that the justice financing framework, but also I think more broadly, the people-centered justice approach are to reality on the ground, right? So how do we make sure that these concepts go beyond the ecosystems of donors and research organizations and all of us in this room, and have the understanding and buy-in of governments and other change makers at the country level, without which these concepts may remain very abstract. The second one is about outcomes, and particularly what are some of the outcome measures that could be used in the context of the justice financing frameworks. I understand that this is in the making, but it seems to be an important point that came out of the discussion today. And then finally, and we've also had the opportunity to discuss this bilaterally, there is also an important point about incentives. And as we move along this path of thinking about cost injustice in terms of minimum spend per person, as for your analogy with education and health, how do we ensure that that doesn't translate in a way into a perverse incentive of delivering justice cheaply and fastly, but without as much focus on quality? And then similarly, what is the incentive structures for governments? What is the incentive structure for other actors like customary and informal justice actors within the justice financing frameworks? Some of the government's incentives may be clearer, and some of the CIJ actors also, when the two systems work well together. But when that is not the case, some of their incentives are not as clear. And I wanted then to conclude based on the discussion today, perhaps speaking a little about what we are thinking to do at the World Bank with the Justice Financing Framework, and how some of our own work builds on the work that is done by others on this point. As I think all of you here know, last year the World Bank launched a global partnership on justice and the rule of law. We had a large event in June. Almost everyone in the room was there and are part of the partnership. And the objective of this partnership is really to exploit each organization's comparative advantage to collectively advance the agenda. And on the financing, I think we have a really good example of how we're putting that into practice. As Marcus mentioned, while ODI and HiiL and others are focusing on the justice financing framework at the World Bank alongside the OECD, we're working on the business case for justice. And from the bank's perspective, we're really thinking about it in terms of cost-benefit analysis of why is it worth it for finance ministers to invest in the justice sectors? What do they get out of it? What are some of the returns that they can claim? Also keeping in mind that element of political economy of, how do you convince politicians that have a fairly short horizon investing into justice reform that sometimes has very long-term payoff. And this is in a way the other side of the coin of, how do you spend more efficiently? But if you somehow get more money, how do you convince them to invest that money in justice? I think Marcus mentioned the point about the 2% of aid being used for justice. How can we make that argument more compelling? And from a World Bank perspective, since we're also hoping to be able to mobilize bank funding into justice reform, and given that our natural counterparts tend to be ministers of finance, how do we convince them that this is a good use of resources? How do we persuade them to borrow more for justice or to allocate more of the borrowed money to justice? So we're really hoping to continue this collaboration so that these two streams of work are cohesive and build on each other. And then perhaps concluding, another way that we're hoping to remain engaged on the justice financing framework, and I think there was quite a bit of segue into this idea from the discussion today, is by engaging maybe one or two countries that work with the bank to pilot some of the ideas of the justice financing framework at the country level. I think Revai also picked up on this point, but again, here the idea is to ensure that the justice financing framework and the people-centered justice concept more broadly don't remain quite as abstract, but can be rolled out maybe at a very small scale in one or two countries so that we can see how they resonate with governments and local authorities and see whether adjustments are necessary. I will stop here. I really look forward to our continued collaboration on this financing element that really seems to be so key to all our organizations, and look forward to seeing what's next. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Erica. We seem to be working like clockwork on time. And thank you to all our speakers and panelists for all the insights that were shared, participants who made the discussion really rich, and for sitting through a long session. I think post-COVID, none of us, like I haven't sat in a 2.5 hour meeting. So thank you for having the patience to do that. But I think we really wanted to have the space to actually have a discussion and not just do a 10-minute discussion. We have taken notes, which will feed into the next iteration of the framework, and we will continue. When I say we, the work stream, not me, the two main authors, ODI HiiL, will continue to work on to refine the framework, seeking inputs in the next stage, perhaps also from some ministers of finance, ministers of justice, and again, we would perhaps be seeking support from World Bank, from UNDP, and from OECD to get access to some of these ministries and to see what makes sense for them and how can we possibly strengthen this. The plan, as Marcus mentioned, is to have the final version of this framework ready by the end of the next year with the background briefs that were mentioned. Marcus, Theresa, if I've forgotten to mention something, please feel free to jump in.
All has been said.
I think all has been said extremely well, except, Swati, I cannot pass up this opportunity to note, as many of us have said, that you will be leaving Pathfinders. So can I just interrupt this meeting just to say on collective part of this community, how much we have valued and appreciated your leadership, your inspiration, your passion, your drive, and the fact that we're all convening here and we're sat for this length of period and that's such a good conversation. We so appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And let's not say bye before thanking Hemba and Leah, my colleagues, without whom this meeting would not have taken place. So thank you so very much for all the support and all the thinking and everything that you've done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yes.